Welcome to Biology 1, Chapter 8, Cellular Energy. In this chapter, we will be taking a look at how organisms obtain their energy, as well as the process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Now remember, energy is a requirement for all living things. Last year in 9th grade physical science, we talked about energy from a little bit different perspective. Energy is the ability to do work. And in particular for the life science of biology, our work is going to mean cellular activities. So things that the cell is making, is exporting, is using for energy. All of that will be referred to as energy. In science, remember, we have scientific laws that explain why certain phenomena happen. The first law of conservation of energy. Remember, energy can't be created or destroyed. It's only converted from one form to another. And life does that in a couple of different ways. It can do that through light or chemistry, or through consuming other living organisms or organic materials. The second law of energy is that entropy will increase with conversion. Now in biology, we consider entropy unusable energy. It's usually given off as heat. It's still an energy conversion, but it's not usable by, in this case, the cell. Living things can be broken up into different categories based on how they get their energy. Autotrophs, auto, remember, means self. So these are organisms that make their own food, either through sunlight or through the rearrangement of chemicals. Plants, trees, flowers, some types of bacteriums are autotrophs. They make their own food. A heterotroph is an organism that has to eat something to get their energy. They have to obtain food by consuming other organisms. Remember, hetero in Latin means other. So in this case, heterotrophs, like you and I, have to get our energy by eating other things. When we talk about cellular metabolism in biology, we're referring to all of the chemical reactions that take place in the cell. And metabolism is occurring in every single one of your body cells all the time, 24/7, 365. So when we, as heterotrophs, consume something, or when a plant gets their food by sunlight, we have to use that energy as organisms, again, to do our life stuff. The energy currency of the cell is a molecule that's called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. You will have to know what ATP stands for. It is a very important biological molecule. Without ATP, life would not be able to exist because there would be no way that cells could get the energy from either the process of sunlight, chemicals, or consuming things. So an ATP molecule looks like here we have in the diagram. We have an adenosine or adenine group that contains nitrogen and carbon and hydrogen. And that is attached to a special type of sugar called a ribose sugar. In biology and chemistry, usually the prefix OSE means a sugar, and the prefix ASE means an enzyme. So ribose is a particular 5-carbon sugar. And the reason why we have the tri in triphosphate is because there are 3 triphosphate groups. So how does ATP generate energy? What it does is uses those phosphate groups as a way to break bonds to give energy to the cell. So we start out with ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Then after we break off a phosphate group, we are left with only 2 phosphate groups. So we move to ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate. If the cell needs more energy, it can break off another phosphorus group, and we can have AMP, or adenosine monophosphate. So every time the bond is broken between the P, phosphorus, and the O, oxygen, energy will be generated for the cell. Now, the great thing about ATP is that it's kind of like a battery. Once the phosphate groups are broken off, they can be reattached to charge energy, and they can be broken to generate some energy for the cell. So we can recharge it like a battery. Now, heterotrophs will recharge by consuming something, and autotrophs will recharge by continuing their process of using sunlight or chemicals to get their food. Plants are autotrophs, and they use the process of photosynthesis to make ATP for the cell. Photosynthesis is where we're going to take light energy from the sun and convert that into the chemical energy of food. So sunlight plus a little bit of carbon dioxide and a little bit of water will turn into oxygen, which is a byproduct, and glucose, which is the sugar that plants use for food. We're going to talk about photosynthesis in phases and parts. Phase 1 is what we call the light reactions. Part 1 is the light-dependent reactions, because light is dependent upon this to happen, so light is required. And the result of part 1 of the light reactions is that ATP is produced. Now, the solar power plant of the plant cell that we talked about in our last chapter, the chloroplasts. These are the organelles that capture the light energy. And of course, they're mainly in the leaves because that is where the most sunlight will be able to be captured. Chloroplast is made up of the thylakoid, which is where all of the action is happening. The thylakoid kind of reminds me of like a flat little stack of quarters. They are part of the light-dependent reactions. The grana is the portion of the chloroplast that contains pigments or colors. And the stroma is the fluid-filled space where ATP is finally made during the light-independent reactions. So here we have a diagram of kind of the inside-y parts of the chloroplast. So pigments, this is where the color is coming from. Pigments are light-absorbing molecules. There is 2 major pigments in plants. There is chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Chlorophyll, of course, is a green color, only because it actually absorbs every other color but green. So chloroplasts will reflect green light, but they absorb light in the violet-blue part of the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. There are also some other pigments in here as well. We call those the carotenoids. Why? Because they're yellow and orange, kind of like a carrot. So the carotenoids make their appearance in the fall time when the chloroplast starts to disappear from the leaf. Now, part 2 of the light-independent reactions is the electron transport chain. Chlorophyll, when it's struck by sunlight, will produce very high energy electrons, and the traveling of those electrons will produce adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And we do this by a process called chemiosmosis. So this is how we form ATP in both the chloroplast for plants and the mitochondria for animal cells. Now, phase 2 of photosynthesis is what we call the Calvin cycle. Part 1 is light-independent reactions. Why? Because we don't need light from here. So the ATP that we just made in phase 1 is now going to be used to make glucose, or the sugar that plants use for food. This is a diagram of the process. We call it the Calvin cycle because it is a cycle. A very important enzyme that's used is termed rubisco, and this drives the process of changing and rearranging the carbon atoms around to make our ATP. You can see we have 6 ATP and 3 ATP from this process. And remember, this is how plants make their energy for food. This is part 1 of Chapter 8, Cellular Energy.